On the evening of March 12, 1981, a man walked into the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. It was nearly 9 o'clock at night. Most of the offices were already dark. The building felt hollow, as if the day had ended and forgotten him. He carried a brown leather briefcase in his right hand. It was not heavy, but it contained enough truth to dismantle an entire family. His name was Richard Coleman. He was 44 years old, a mid-level analyst at the United States Department of Commerce. He did not come to the FBI because he wanted justice. He came because every other option had collapsed. 3 hours later, when he walked back out into the cold March air, his wife would be under federal investigation for espionage, and his 3 children would unknowingly become the center of one of the most carefully maintained lies of the Cold War. Richard Coleman was not a man trained for betrayal. He was trained for analysis, for cautious language, for reports that avoided conclusions. He lived with his family in Arlington, Virginia, a quiet suburb just across the river from Washington. Tree-lined streets, 2-story colonial houses, the kind of place where nothing important was supposed to happen. Richard had worked at the Department of Commerce since 1973. Not intelligence, not defense, trade analysis, close enough to power to matter, far enough away to feel harmless. His wife, Margaret Coleman, worked in the same department, 3 days a week, an administrative assistant in the Office of Trade Policy. She had once worked full-time, but after their first child was born, she reduced her hours. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she taught piano lessons from their home. Students came and went through the afternoon. Music drifted softly through the house. They had 3 children. Jennifer was 13, Michael was 11, Sarah was 8. From the outside, the Colemans were ordinary, a dual-income family navigating suburban life in the early Reagan years. Nothing about them suggested secrets. Nothing about them suggested espionage. That illusion began to fracture in late January. On January 28, 1981, Richard came home from work early, around 2:30 in the afternoon. He later described it as flu symptoms, a headache, dizziness, the kind of sickness that pulls you towards sleep. When his car pulled into the driveway, Margaret was upstairs. She came down almost immediately. Too immediately. At the time, it did not feel dramatic, just wrong. Her face was flushed, her movements rushed. She asked questions that did not need answers. "Why are you home so early? Are you feeling all right? Did something happen at work?" Richard dismissed it. He went upstairs, lay down in the guest room, fell asleep. That evening passed without incident. It was the next morning that changed everything. In the master bedroom closet, near the back wall, there was a floorboard that never quite fit right. It sat slightly higher than the others. Richard had noticed it for months, always meant to fix it, always delayed. That morning, it was raised just enough to draw his attention. When he pried it loose, he found a small metal box underneath, 8 inches by 6, cold, plain. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Photographs of documents, trade analysis reports, policy assessments, briefing papers. Some of them Richard recognized immediately. They were his. Others came from offices Margaret had access to, papers that crossed her desk every day. There were letters written in Russian, not plain Russian, coded. Receipts from a photo development shop in Georgetown, dated across several months. And a small notebook, 3 by 5 inches, filled with columns of numbers and abbreviations. Richard stood there longer than he could later remember. He did not shout. He did not confront Margaret. He did not wake the children. Something in him understood that once he spoke, there would be no return. Instead, he closed the box, replaced the floorboard, and went to work. That day, he barely spoke. He watched Margaret across the dinner table, listened to her talk to the children, heard her laugh, and for the first time in 16 years of marriage, he realized he did not know who she was. That night, he made a quiet decision. If this was real, he needed proof. If it was a misunderstanding, he needed certainty. Certainty required patience. The next day, while Margaret was out, Richard opened the box again. He photographed everything, every document, every letter, every page of the notebook. He used his own camera, a Canon AE-1, normally reserved for birthdays and vacations. He took 2 full rolls of film. Then he drove to a photo development shop he had never used before, paid cash, used a false name. When the prints were ready, he stored them in a locked drawer at his office, somewhere Margaret would never look. Then he waited. Every few days, he checked the box again. February 3rd, February 7th, February 11th. Each time he noted what had changed. On February 7th, 3 new photographs appeared. They showed internal Commerce Department memoranda about grain export policies to Eastern Europe. One of them was a report Richard himself had worked on, a report he had brought home 2 weeks earlier, a report that had sat briefly and carelessly in his briefcase. That realization made him physically ill. Margaret was not only accessing her own office, she was accessing him, his work, his trust, his home. And now, something else became clear. This was not impulsive, not accidental. It was systematic, methodical. Whatever Margaret was involved in had started long before he found the box. Richard did not confront her. Instead, he began to observe. For 6 weeks, Richard Coleman lived inside his own home like a quiet investigator, not trained, not authorized, but careful. He kept a log, a small notebook in the glove compartment of his car. Dates, times, observations. Nothing emotional, nothing speculative, only facts. Patterns emerged quickly. Margaret always checked the mailbox before Richard came home. She lingered by the street longer than necessary. She made phone calls from the kitchen, short conversations that ended when he entered the room. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, her non-work days, she ran errands in the evening, always between 7:15 and 8:45, always alone. She said she was going to the grocery store, the pharmacy, sometimes to visit her friend Patricia. Richard had no reason to doubt her, until he did. On February 2nd, a Tuesday, Margaret left the house at 7:23 p.m. Richard waited 3 minutes. Then he followed. He stayed far enough back that she would not see his headlights, far enough that she would not notice if she checked the mirror. She did not go to the grocery store. She drove to a small park near the river, about 4 miles from their home. She parked, walked directly to a bench overlooking the water, and sat. She did not meet anyone. She did not speak. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she stared at the river. At 8:02 p.m., she stood up, returned to her car, and drove to a convenience store. She bought milk and bread, an errand that made sense, an errand that explained her absence. Richard wrote it all down. The pattern repeated. Same days, same bench, same duration, always 20 minutes. Richard began arriving early. He positioned himself where he could observe without being seen. He expected a meeting, an exchange, a conversation. He saw none, and that disturbed him more than if he had. What he began to understand was that this was not about people meeting. It was about timing, objects, places, dead drops. On February 26th, Richard arrived 2 hours early. He watched as a man sat briefly on the bench, read a newspaper, left it behind. Minutes later, a jogger picked it up and ran on. When Margaret arrived, the bench was empty. She sat, placed her purse on the left side, waited exactly 20 minutes. When she left, her purse appeared slightly less full. Richard had been briefed on counterintelligence before. He knew what he had just witnessed. Dead drops were designed to remove human contact. No conversation, no eye contact, no reassurance. They turned relationships into distances. Richard watched his wife sit on that bench and realized something painful. He could see her, but he could no longer reach the truth she was carrying. At home, he watched her nights more closely. On March 3rd, he pretended to fall asleep on the couch. Near midnight, Margaret came downstairs, checked to make sure he was asleep, then went into the basement. After she returned upstairs, Richard waited. Then he followed. Behind a stack of old paint cans, he found a canvas bag. Inside were false identification documents, Margaret's photograph, a different name, Elaine Warner, cash, maps with locations marked, a calendar matching the Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He photographed everything, returned the bag exactly as he found it. That night, Richard did not sleep. By early March, he understood something unavoidable. This was no longer about discovery. It was about decision. Every possible choice would destroy something. He thought about the children, Jennifer, Michael, Sarah. If he reported Margaret, the arrest would be public. The trial would be public. They would become known as the children of a Soviet spy. If he stayed silent, he became complicit. Every document passed, every report sent to Moscow. Silence was no longer neutral. The decision formed slowly, not in a dramatic moment, but in quiet acceptance. He could not protect everyone. He needed a story for his children, not for the government. Cancer, an illness serious enough to explain absence, complex enough to discourage questions, tragic enough to prevent doubt. On March 12, 1981, Richard walked into the FBI. He laid out everything: photographs, logs, dates. He insisted on two things: that his wife be arrested immediately, and that his children not know the truth. After debate, the FBI agreed. Margaret was arrested early on the morning of March 14th. She was making coffee. She did not resist. She looked at Richard and said, "You found it." The children were asleep upstairs. That afternoon, Richard told them their mother was sick, very sick. He used the word cancer. They believed him. Why wouldn't they? Years passed. Margaret pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 25 years. Richard maintained the lie. The children adapted. Jennifer focused on school. Michael took things apart. Sarah grew quiet. Letters arrived from prison. Richard locked them away. The lie became routine, and routines are difficult to break. In 1987, Jennifer began to question the timeline. 6 years was a long time for treatment. She called her father and asked when her mother had actually died. Richard told her the truth. The damage was immediate. Michael reacted with anger, Sarah with silence. Trust dissolved. In 1995, the children visited their mother in prison. They built something resembling a relationship, measured in minutes. Richard never visited. Margaret was released in 2006. Richard died in 2010. After his death, the children found the letters, hundreds of them, unread. They realized their father had never stopped listening. He had simply chosen silence. This story is often told as a counterintelligence success, but it is not really about espionage. It is about control, about fear disguised as protection. The Cold War ended on paper. Borders shifted, flags changed. But inside this family, it never truly ended. It lived in unanswered questions, in trust that could not be fully repaired. The Cold War was fought between nations, but its deepest scars were carved into families who never chose to be part of it.